The sun cast long shadows over the dusty streets of Willow Creek as Gabriella Lawson knelt at the wooden altar of the small church, her shoulders trembling as she whispered the same prayer she'd been offering every day for 3 years. "Lord, please bring him home to me." The year was 1871, and hope was a luxury that had grown as scarce as rain in the parched Wyoming territory. Gabriella Gabby, to those who knew her, was 22 and wore her chestnut hair pinned beneath a simple bonnet, her once vibrant green eyes now dulled by years of waiting. She ran her fingers over the worn silver ring hanging from a chain around her neck, the one Ethan Armstrong had placed there before riding off to seek his fortune in the untamed territories. 3 years of silence had convinced everyone in town that he was dead, everyone except Gabby. "Still at it, I see," came a voice from behind her. Mrs. Henderson, the butcher's wife, stood in the doorway with a basket of bread. Her expression held that familiar mixture of pity and exasperation. "Sweetheart, it's been 3 years. Even Pastor Miller has said it's time to accept God's will." "This is God's will," Gabby replied without turning around. "I know Ethan's alive. I can feel it here." She pressed a hand to her heart. Mrs. Henderson sighed and placed a loaf of bread on the pew beside Gabby. "Martha Wells' son has been asking about you. He's got steady work at the bank now." "A good match." Gabby finally turned, her face resolute. "Thank you for the bread, but I've made my choice. Prayers won't bring back the dead, child, Mrs. Henderson said gently, then left Gabby alone in the empty church, the afternoon light filtering through the stained glass windows, painting the worn wooden floor with patches of color. Later that day, Gabby walked the familiar path back to her family's modest farm on the outskirts of town. Since her father's passing last winter, she'd managed to keep the small homestead running with the help of her younger brother Thomas, who at 16 had taken on the responsibilities of a man. Their mother had died years earlier, leaving the three of them to forge their way in the harsh frontier. The farm wasn't much a small cabin, a barn that leaned slightly to the east, a chicken coop, and fields that produced just enough to keep them fed with a little extra to sell in town. It wasn't the life Gabby had imagined for herself when Ethan had placed his mother's ring in her palm and promised to return with enough gold to build them a proper house. "I've got the chickens fed," Thomas called as she approached the cabin. He was splitting logs by the woodpile, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal arms that were becoming more muscled with each passing season. Mrs. Peterson stopped by with some preserves, said it was payment for fixing her wagon wheel. "That was kind of her," Gabby replied, setting her basket down on the porch. "I'll make a stew tonight." Thomas paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "Did you go to the church again today?" Gabby nodded, avoiding her brother's gaze. Though Thomas never said it outright, she knew he had joined the ranks of those who believed Ethan was never coming back. "Gab," he said hesitantly, "Sheriff Parker mentioned there's a teaching position opening at the schoolhouse. Miss Winters is getting married and moving to Denver. You should consider it." "I'll think about it," she replied, though they both knew she wouldn't. Taking such a position would mean accepting a future without Ethan, and she wasn't prepared to do that. Inside the cabin, Gabby went through the motions of preparing dinner, her hands working automatically while her mind wandered. She remembered the day Ethan had left, his blue eyes bright with excitement and promise. He'd been 22 then, tall and lean with sandy brown hair that refused to stay combed. The son of the local blacksmith, he'd worked alongside his father until rumors of gold in the Northern Territories had ignited his dreams of providing Gabby with more than a blacksmith's modest living. 1 year, he'd promised, kissing her beneath the old oak tree by the creek. 2 at the most. I'll come back with enough for us to start proper, maybe even open a shop of my own in town. 1 year had turned to 2 and 2 to 3. Letters had arrived sporadically at first, tales of the journey, descriptions of the mountains that seemed to touch the sky, accounts of the rough men he'd met in mining camps. Then the letters had stopped altogether. The town gossips had woven their theories. He'd been killed by Indians, fallen down a mine shaft, frozen to death in a blizzard, or whispered by some found himself another woman in some frontier town. Pastor Miller had held a memorial service after the 2-year mark, though without a body to bury. Gabby had refused to attend. That night, after Thomas had gone to bed, Gabby sat on the porch steps, watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. She twisted Ethan's ring between her fingers, a habit that had worn the silver smooth. "I know you're out there," she whispered to the night. "I know you're trying to come home." The following morning brought unexpected news. Sheriff Parker arrived at the farm just as Gabby was hanging laundry on the line. "Morning, Miss Lawson," he called, tipping his hat. The sheriff was a fair man in his 40s, his beard now more salt than pepper. "Got some interesting information you might want to hear." Gabby's heart quickened. "What is it?" Stage brought in the mail yesterday. There was a letter for the Wells family from their cousin up in Montana Territory. Mentioned a man passing through Helena who was asking about a town called Willow Creek in Wyoming. Said the man's name was Armstrong. The clothespin Gabby was holding clattered to the ground. "When?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "When was this?" "Letter was dated nearly a month ago," the sheriff replied, watching her carefully. "Now, I don't want you getting your hopes up too high, Miss Lawson. Helena's a growing place, lots of folks passing through, could be another Armstrong entirely." But Gabby wasn't listening. Her mind was racing with possibilities. Did the letter say anything else? Where he was headed? Sheriff Parker shook his head. "That was all, but I thought you should know." After the sheriff left, Gabby sank down onto the porch steps, her legs suddenly too weak to hold her. After 3 years of silence, this small fragment of information felt like a drowning person's first gulp of air. When Thomas returned from delivering eggs to town, she told him the news. "Gabby," he said gently, "even if it was Ethan, that was a month ago. He could be anywhere by now. And why hasn't he written if he's alive and well?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But this is the first real sign I've had in 3 years. I have to believe it means something." That evening, her prayers at the old wooden table were more fervent than ever. "Please, Lord, guide him home. Let this be real." The next few weeks passed in a state of heightened anticipation. Gabby found herself jumping at every sound, rushing to the window at the approach of hoofbeats, scanning the faces of strangers in town. But as days turned to weeks with no further news, the tiny spark of hope that had been rekindled began to flicker. It was a Saturday in early June when everything changed. Gabby was in town, bartering eggs for sugar at Whitaker's general store when she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. "Heard there was trouble up at Baker's Pass," Mr. Whitaker was telling another customer. "Stage got robbed. Driver said it was the Hanson gang." The Hanson gang. Even in Willow Creek, that name inspired fear. 3 brothers and their associates who had been terrorizing the territories for years, robbing stage coaches and banks, leaving few survivors to identify them. "Anyone hurt?" asked the other man, a rancher from outside town. "Driver and 2 passengers killed. 1 man wounded pretty bad. They brought him to Doc Wilson's place yesterday." Gabby's hands trembled as she gathered her purchases. Baker's Pass was only 20 miles north of Willow Creek, if Ethan was making his way home from Montana. Without thinking, she found herself walking rapidly toward Doc Wilson's house at the end of Main Street. The doctor had converted his front parlor into a waiting room, with a treatment room behind it and a recovery room upstairs. As Gabby approached, she saw Mrs. Wilson tending to her garden out front. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson," Gabby called, trying to keep her voice steady. "I heard about the stage robbery victim. Is he going to be all right?" The doctor's wife straightened up, pushing a strand of gray hair back beneath her bonnet. "Hard to say, dear. Lost a lot of blood from the gunshot wound. George operated yesterday, but the man's still unconscious. No identification on him either, poor soul." Would it be possible for me to see him?" Gabby asked, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain Mrs. Wilson must hear it. The older woman's eyes softened with understanding. "You're wondering if it might be your young man?" Gabby nodded, unable to speak. Mrs. Wilson sighed. "Well, I suppose it couldn't hurt. George is out on a call, but I can take you up for a moment." "The man needs his rest, though." She led Gabby through the house and up the narrow staircase to a small room at the back. The curtains were drawn, casting the space in shadow, but there was enough light to see the figure on the bed. A man lay still beneath a thin blanket, his face turned away from the door. Gabby approached slowly, her legs feeling as if they might give way beneath her. The man's hair was dark, not the sandy brown she remembered, and he had a beard that Ethan had never worn. Disappointment washed over her, so intense that tears sprang to her eyes. "It's not him," she whispered. "I'm sorry, dear," Mrs. Wilson said, patting her arm, "but perhaps that's good news in its own way. Means your young man wasn't shot by outlaws." As they turned to leave, a weak voice called from the bed. "Water, please." Mrs. Wilson hurried to pour a glass from the pitcher on the nightstand. Gabby, feeling helpless but wanting to assist, moved to help raise the man's head so he could drink. As she leaned over him, the man's eyes fluttered open blue eyes that, despite the pain clouding them, she would have recognized anywhere. "Ethan," she gasped, nearly dropping him in shock. The man's cracked lips formed her name, though no sound emerged. "Gabby." Mrs. Wilson looked between them in astonishment. "Is it really him? You're Ethan Armstrong?" Gabby couldn't speak. She nodded, tears streaming down her face as she clutched Ethan's hand. His fingers, once strong and calloused from blacksmith work, felt thin and fragile in hers. "I'll get some broth, Mrs. Wilson said quietly, leaving them alone. "You're alive," Gabby finally managed, her voice breaking. "All this time I knew it. I knew you were alive." Ethan's eyes, sunken in his gaunt face, never left hers. "Tried to get back to you," he whispered. "So many times." "Don't talk now," she urged, brushing lank hair from his forehead. "Save your strength. You're here now, that's all that matters." Over the next several days, Gabby barely left Ethan's side. Doc Wilson had removed the bullet from his shoulder, but infection had set in, and for 2 days and nights, Ethan burned with fever, delirious and weak. Gabby bathed his forehead with cool cloths, spooned broth between his lips when he was lucid enough to swallow, and prayed more fervently than ever. The town buzzed with the news. Ethan Armstrong, long presumed dead, had returned after all. Many came by Doc Wilson's house, ostensibly to check on the patient but really to confirm the miraculous tale with their own eyes. Some, like Mrs. Henderson, had the grace to look abashed when facing Gabby. "Well," the butcher's wife said, twisting her hands in her apron, "it seems your faith was rewarded after all." On the 3rd day, Ethan's fever broke. He was still weak, but his eyes were clear when they fixed on Gabby's face. "You're really here," he said, his voice stronger than it had been. "I thought I might be dreaming." "I'm here," she confirmed, squeezing his hand. "And so are you, finally." When he was strong enough to speak for more than a few minutes at a time, Ethan began to tell her what had happened. He had indeed found gold, enough to make their dreams possible, in a small claim in Montana territory. But on his way to register the claim, he'd been ambushed by 3 men who had been watching the successful miners. "They took everything," he said, bitterness lacing his words. "My gold, my horse, even my boots. Beat me so badly I couldn't walk for days. By the time I recovered enough to make it to the nearest town, I had nothing left but the clothes on my back." "Why didn't you write?" Gabby asked, the question that had haunted her for years. "I did at first. Then I heard that a mail coach had been robbed on the route to Wyoming. I wrote again and again. After a while, I realized the letters weren't getting through." He closed his eyes briefly. "I took whatever work I could find, saved every penny. Twice I got close to having enough to make it back, and twice something happened, sickness once, robbery the next time. But you kept trying," Gabby said softly. His eyes met hers, filled with a determination she remembered well. "I promised you I'd come back, no matter how long it took." As June turned to July, Ethan grew stronger. Doc Wilson declared him well enough to leave his care, though he would need time for his shoulder to fully heal. The question arose of where he would stay. "Your father's forge has been taken over by Jenkins," Gabby explained as they sat on the porch of Doc Wilson's house. "And your family home." She hesitated. After Ethan's father had died the previous year, the house had been sold to pay debts. "It doesn't matter," Ethan said, taking her hand. "As long as I'm back with you." Thomas, who had been skeptical at first, gradually warmed to Ethan's return. The younger Lawson had been shouldering the burden of the farm alone for too long, and despite his injury, Ethan was eager to help. "We've got a spare room," Thomas offered one evening as they sat around the kitchen table. "It's small, but it's yours if you want it, at least until you two figure things out." Gabby felt her cheeks flush. In the chaos of Ethan's return and recovery, they had barely spoken of their future. The engagement that had been understood between them 3 years ago seemed both incredibly distant and achingly immediate. Ethan looked at her, a question in his eyes. "I'd be honored to stay if Gabby agrees." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak without her voice betraying the riot of emotions inside her. That night, after Thomas had gone to bed, Gabby and Ethan sat on the porch steps, the same spot where she had spent countless evenings looking at the stars and praying for his return. "I don't have anything to offer you now," Ethan said, his voice low. "Everything I worked for, everything I promised you, it's gone." Gabby turned to look at him, really look at him. The 3 years had changed him. His face was thinner, lines etched at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there before. There was a scar along his jaw that was new, and his hands bore marks of hardships she could only begin to imagine. But his eyes, they were the same blue that had captivated her since she was 16. "You came back," she said simply. "That's all I ever asked for in my prayers." He reached for her hand then, his touch hesitant as if he feared she might pull away. When she didn't, he brought her fingers to his lips. "I don't deserve you, Gabriella Lawson." "Good thing it's not about deserving," she replied with a small smile. The next few weeks fell into a pattern. Ethan's shoulder healed slowly, but he insisted on helping around the farm despite Gabby's protests. Thomas taught him the routines they'd established, and Ethan proved a quick study. The 3 of them worked together, and for the first time since her father's death, Gabby felt the farm becoming a home again rather than just a burden to be carried. But rebuilding a life together after 3 years apart wasn't without its challenges. Sometimes Gabby would catch Ethan staring into the distance, his expression haunted, and know he was reliving some hardship from his time away. Other times, she would find herself hesitating before reaching for his hand, the habit of loneliness not easily broken. One evening in early August, Gabby returned from town to find Ethan sitting at the kitchen table, a small leather pouch in front of him. "What's that?" she asked, setting down her basket of purchases. "Something I've been keeping safe," he replied, pushing the pouch toward her. "Open it." Inside, she found a small gold nugget no bigger than the end of her thumb. "Ethan, it's all I managed to hide when I was robbed," he explained. "I kept it sewn into the lining of my boot. It's not much, not nearly what I promised you, but it's a start." Gabby closed her hand around the nugget, feeling its solid weight. "What do you want to do with it?" "Well," he said, looking uncharacteristically nervous, "I was thinking we might see if Jenkins would consider taking me on at the forge. I still remember the trade. With this as an investment and what you and Thomas have saved, maybe we could even buy a small share of the business." She studied his face, seeing the hope there mixed with uncertainty. "Is that what you want, to be a blacksmith again?" Ethan stood, moving closer to her. "What I want is a life with you, Gabby. A stable one, here in Willow Creek. No more chasing dreams across the territories. I've learned the hard way that the real treasure was right here all along." That night, Gabby added a new prayer to her nightly ritual. Thanks for the answer that had finally come. The following Sunday, Gabby and Ethan attended church together for the first time since his return. They walked down the center aisle, aware of the eyes following them, the whispers behind hands. Pastor Miller, who had once presided over Ethan's memorial service, welcomed him warmly. "A miracle," the pastor declared, shaking Ethan's hand vigorously. "A testament to God's mysterious ways and Miss Lawson's unwavering faith." After the service, as they stood in the churchyard, Mrs. Henderson approached them. "I owe you an apology, Gabriella," she said, her usual briskness softened. "We all thought you were clinging to a fantasy. But you knew better than any of us." "Faith isn't always rational, Mrs. Henderson," Gabby replied, feeling Ethan's hand warm in hers. "But that doesn't make it any less real." The conversation with Jenkins about the forge went better than either of them had dared hope. The man had been struggling with the workload, and the prospect of having a skilled blacksmith like Ethan join the business was appealing. They struck a deal. Ethan would work for wages at first, with the option to buy into the business gradually. "It's not what I dreamed of giving you," Ethan said as they walked home from Jenkins' shop. "Not a grand house or fine dresses." "I never wanted those things," Gabby assured him. "Just you safe and home." That evening, as the late summer sun cast golden light across the fields, Ethan took Gabby's hand and led her to the old oak tree by the creek, the same spot where they had said goodbye 3 years earlier. "I've been carrying something else besides that gold nugget," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small object wrapped in a scrap of cloth. "This kept me going on the darkest days." He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small, tarnished locket. Inside was a tiny sketch of Gabby that he had carried with him on his journey. "I looked at this every night," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Promised myself I'd get back to you somehow." Gabby touched the sketch with trembling fingers. "I can't believe you kept this safe all this time." "It wasn't the only thing," Ethan said, reaching for the chain around her neck where his mother's ring still hung. "You kept this safe for me too." He carefully undid the clasp of the chain and slid the ring off, holding it between his fingers. "I asked you once to wear this as a promise. I'm asking again, but this time I don't want to wait. I've lost too much time already." Gabby's heart pounded as Ethan dropped to one knee beneath the oak tree, the setting sun filtering through the leaves above them. "Gabriella Lawson, will you marry me?" "Not someday, not when I've made my fortune, but now just as we are." Tears blurred her vision as she nodded. "Yes, just as we are." The news of their engagement spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. Most of the town had assumed it was a foregone conclusion after Ethan's return, but the official announcement still caused a stir of excitement. The women of the town immediately began planning, led by an enthusiastic Mrs. Henderson, who seemed determined to make up for her years of doubt with an abundance of wedding preparations. September would be lovely, Mrs. Henderson declared over tea in the Lawson kitchen. The harvest will be in, and the weather still fair enough for an outdoor celebration. Gabby exchanged an amused glance with Ethan. They had envisioned something simple, but it seemed the town had other ideas. After years of pitying poor Gabby Lawson with her hopeless prayers and misplaced faith, the people of Willow Creek were embracing her vindication with surprising enthusiasm. "Let them fuss," Ethan whispered to her later. "They need it as much as we do, a reminder that sometimes prayers really are answered." The weeks leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind. Ethan threw himself into his work at the forge, determined to prove himself to Jenkins. Gabby divided her time between the farm and preparations for their future together. They had decided to live at the Lawson farm for the time being, with plans to add a room to the cabin once they had saved enough. Thomas, for his part, seemed to thrive with Ethan's presence. The two formed a bond that went beyond mere friendship or future brotherhood. They worked side by side in the fields, Ethan teaching Thomas blacksmithing basics in the evenings, and Thomas showing Ethan the improvements he'd made to the farm over the years. "You know," Thomas said one evening as they sat on the porch, "I stopped believing he was coming back long before most people in town did." Gabby looked at her brother in surprise. He had never admitted this outright before. "I thought it was kinder to let you move on," Thomas continued. "But now I see that faith like yours. It's a rare thing, something to be respected, not pitied." The night before the wedding, Gabby stood alone in the small bedroom that had been hers since childhood, running her hands over the simple white dress that Mrs. Wilson and several other women from town had helped her make. Tomorrow she would become Gabriella Armstrong, the name she had dreamed of for so long that it felt more familiar than her own. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Ethan standing there, looking uncharacteristically hesitant. "It's bad luck to see the bride before the wedding," she teased. "I think we've had our share of bad luck already," he replied with a smile. "I have something for you, a wedding gift." He held out a small wooden box, beautifully carved with a pattern of oak leaves the same as the tree where they had said both goodbye and hello again. "Did you make this?" she asked, tracing the intricate design. "Jenkins helped. Said I needed to prove I could do fine work as well as horseshoes and wagon wheels." Inside the box was a delicate silver bracelet, simple but elegantly crafted. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Turn it over," Ethan urged. On the inside of the band, nearly invisible unless you knew to look, were the words "Faith Rewarded." Gabby felt tears prick her eyes. "I love it, and I love you, Ethan Armstrong." He drew her close, his lips finding hers in a kiss that held the promise of all the years ahead of them. "I love you too. Always have, always will." The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the September air carrying just the first hint of autumn crispness. The ceremony was held under the old oak tree by the creek, the very spot that had witnessed so much of their story. It seemed the entire town of Willow Creek had turned out, filling the meadow with color and noise. Pastor Miller spoke of faith and perseverance, of love that endured against all odds. When it came time for the vows, Ethan took both of Gabby's hands in his. "Gabriella Lawson, you never stopped believing in me, even when I had lost faith in myself. You prayed when others pitied, you hoped when others mourned. I promise to spend the rest of my days being worthy of that faith. To love you, to honor you, to stand beside you through whatever life brings our way." Gabby's voice shook slightly as she responded. "Ethan Armstrong, Your return was the answer to prayers that sustained me for 3 long years. I promise to love you in plenty and in want, in joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health. Whatever paths lie ahead of us, we will walk them together." As Ethan slipped his mother's ring onto her finger this time to stay, a murmur went through the gathered crowd. Even those who had been most skeptical of Gabby's unwavering belief could not deny the power of the moment. Faith, against all odds, had been rewarded. The celebration afterward was joyous, with tables set up in the meadow, music from fiddles and a banjo, dancing that continued well into the evening. Sheriff Parker surprised everyone with a gift, the deed to a small plot of land adjacent to the Lawson farm, paid for by a collection taken up among the townspeople. "For when you're ready to build that home you talked about," the sheriff said, clapping Ethan on the shoulder. "Consider it the town's way of welcoming you back from the dead." As the sun began to set, casting the meadow in the same golden light that had illuminated their engagement, Ethan led Gabby away from the celebration and back to their oak tree. "Happy?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied, leaning back against his chest. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't been on that stage coach, if you had taken a different route home?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, his breath warm against her hair. "I think I would have found my way back to you regardless. Some things are just meant to be, Gabby. Your prayers made sure of that." The years that followed brought changes to Willow Creek and to the Armstrongs. Ethan's skill as a blacksmith earned him a full partnership with Jenkins within 2 years, and eventually ownership of the forge when the older man retired. They built a small house on the plot of land gifted to them by the town, not far from the Lawson farmhouse where Thomas continued to work the land. Their first child, a daughter they named Faith, arrived on a spring morning almost exactly 9 months after their wedding. She had Ethan's blue eyes and Gabby's determined spirit. A son, Joseph, followed 2 years later, and another daughter, Emma, 2 years after that. The gold rush that had lured Ethan away eventually waned, but Willow Creek grew steadily as the railroad came through, bringing new settlers and opportunities. Through it all, Gabby and Ethan built the life they had once only dreamed of, not one of extravagant wealth as Ethan had originally planned, but one rich in love, family, and community. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ethan surprised Gabby by taking her back to their oak tree, now part of a small park at the edge of town. Their children played nearby, watched over by a doting Thomas and his wife, Clara. 10 years, Gabby mused, leaning against the trunk of the tree that had witnessed so much of their story. "Sometimes it feels like you never left at all." Ethan touched the silver bracelet that still adorned her wrist, his fingers tracing the words hidden on its underside. "And sometimes I wake up afraid it was all a dream, that I'm still out there somewhere, trying to find my way back to you." Gabby took his face in her hands, studying the familiar features that had only grown dearer with time. The sandy hair now had threads of silver at the temples, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, but they were the same blue eyes that had captured her heart all those years ago. "You're home, Ethan Armstrong. You have been for 10 years. Thanks to you," he replied, drawing her close. "And those prayers that no one believed were heard." As the setting sun cast its golden light through the branches of the oak tree, painting them in the same warm glow that had illuminated both their parting and their reunion, Gabby offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the life they had built together, a life founded on a faith that had refused to falter, even when all evidence pointed to loss. In the distance, their children's laughter rang out, a joyful sound that seemed to Gabby the most beautiful answer to prayer she could have imagined. Ethan's arm tightened around her waist, anchoring her in the present even as her mind wandered through memories of the past. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice low and intimate in the gathering dusk. "About how many people told me to stop praying for you," she replied honestly. "How many times I was urged to accept what everyone else believed was true." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It must have been lonely, being the only one who still believed." "It was," she admitted. "But the alternative was unthinkable. Giving up on you meant giving up on everything I knew in my heart to be true." As twilight deepened around them, Gabby realized that their story had become something of a legend in Willow Creek, a tale told to remind people of the power of unwavering faith and love that refused to surrender to doubt. Young couples now came to this oak tree to exchange promises, inspired by the blacksmith and the woman whose prayers had brought him home against impossible odds. Faith, aged 9 and precocious beyond her years, ran up to them then, her siblings close behind. "Papa, Uncle Thomas says it's time to light the lanterns for the celebration." Ethan scooped his daughter up, her laughter echoing through the gathering darkness. "Then we'd better not keep everyone waiting, should we?" As they walked together toward the lights of the town's celebration, Gabby's hand firmly in his and their children dancing around them, Ethan leaned close to whisper in her ear. "Your prayers might have brought me home, Gabby Armstrong, but it's your love that keeps me here." In that moment, surrounded by the family they had created together, Gabby knew with absolute certainty that some prayers were answered not in grand, dramatic gestures, but in the quiet, enduring miracle of a love that had refused to be extinguished by distance, time, or doubt. And in Willow Creek, whenever someone spoke of impossible hopes or unanswered prayers, someone else would inevitably mention Gabriella Lawson Armstrong, the woman whose faith had been strong enough to bring a lost cowboy home, proving to them all that sometimes, against all odds and reason, prayers really were heard.